Hi, my name is Tift Merritt, and I want to tell you just a little bit of background information about Caring For and With Archives, our Story Plus project this year. A century ago, Dr. Frank Wepley took photographs and portraits at the Goldsboro State Hospital, North Carolina's segregated insane asylum. The negatives and corresponding ledgers were found in his son's New York City apartment in the late 90s and returned to the hospital for the good of the patients. I want to read you a mission statement we've been working on. The Hungry River Project is a collective working to reunite the people in the pictures with their families. While these images are a rare reconnection to lost stories, they are also a powerful indictment of the systems which produced them and repeatedly failed the people within them. We believe that the good of the patient can only be determined in the hands of their descendant families. We work to honor the suffering we cannot relieve, and get these souls home. I bumped into this archive researching a creative project at Cherry Hospital some time ago, and Caring For and With Archives approached the caretakers in these images as a beta test for research and a jumping off point for the larger questions the archive poses. What should really happen to these pictures? How can we be responsible to and care for the people in these pictures? When I met the people in these pictures, I promised them that I would surround them with people who would help figure out the right thing to do. And I want to give a huge shout out to the minds and hearts in this Story Plus project and turn it over to them.
In order to ground these photographs within a historical moment, I began researching the history of diagnosing and treating mental illness in African Americans. American psychiatry has been historically rooted in racist ideology that did not account for the societal and environmental causes of insanity. From the 1840s to 1890s, insanity was believed to be a disease of civilization, something that African Americans were thought to not have the mental faculties to be a part of. As African Americans gained freedom, mental illness became a tool used in pro-slavery propaganda to restrict the freedoms of African Americans. From the 1890s through the 1920s, institutionalized racism became the driving force behind the restriction of Black freedom. Segregated mental asylums joined jailhouses and poorhouses and a broader network of institutions that disproportionately targeted African Americans. From the mass incarceration of African Americans to the welfare state, these institutions continue to limit their freedoms in the form of removing access to various forms of material, economic, and political capital.
In my research, I focused on the relationship between the North Carolina asylum for the colored insane and the local media, and how the local community viewed the occupants of the asylum. In particular, I examined the local African American newspaper in Goldsboro and also a local white newspaper, and they were called the Goldsboro Star and the Weekly Argus, respectively. Both newspapers made very limited mentions of the hospital and did not give specific stories of the patient. The individual patient's experiences were largely erased in the dominant media form that was available to the general public in the late 1800s and early 1900s. While the local newspapers covered from national stories to very localized stories, such as who was moving in and out of the community, they failed to talk about a large state hospital that was within their relatively small town. I think this subject is very important because it reflects the media's reluctance to discuss mental health. While today, more and more people are coming out and sharing their stories and being able to seek help, many of the coverage with psychiatric hospitals is still very limited.
In my personal research to systematically identify as many caretakers' photographs as I could, the system that worked best for me examined census data. Censuses gave me the most information about a given family in a concise, digestible format. Suppose For example, that I was given a photo of a couple from Goldsboro taken between 1918 and 1926, and the man's name was John Doe. I could go through the census data from 1920 from Goldsboro County, found the hospital grounds specific section, and scanned for John Doe. He would have probably been listed as the head of house, and his wife's name would presumably be listed below, Jane Doe. However, that's not all I could necessarily find. With that, I may see their ages, John's occupation, their children's names and ages, Jane's occupation, their races, whether they could read and write. Often these entries led down a rabbit hole of information, and while it only begins to scratch the surface of the lives and stories of those in the images, their names and their records hold power. However, as I became more comfortable analyzing census data using this strategy to identify more people, I noticed that some records were far more meticulously taken and easier to trace than others. Inconsistencies across various censuses were mostly responsible for these discrepancies. Name spellings frequently changed, birth years were recorded differently, each race was even subject to change across the decades of census data. These discrepancies disproportionately affected Black men and women I researched, likely because institutional racism plays a large role in these inconsistencies. The education of Black men and women received was often substandard, leading to Black populations being disproportionately illiterate. When censuses, because of this, were verbally reported, spelling was subject to the preferences of whomever collected it. This is but one example of how institutional racism enables mass erasure of Black histories and fundamentally disrupts Black genealogy. In my research, census inconsistencies such as these often made it more tedious to connect the caretakers and the histories, but I felt impassioned to find as many pieces as I could. I took special interest in identifying any children that were photographed to connect them with family trees that exist beyond the hospital. To me, carrying forward with the archives meant fighting against Black historical erasure and bringing to light connections between Black families and Black communities.
All right, so the first part of my research is kind of like, so we're dealing with the photo archives, and so I would say 70 to 80% of the Dr. Wellesley's photos, they actually contain people inside of it. So initially I used this app called Kumu, and I used Kumu to try to sort out all the people that appear inside of the Dr. Wellesley photos, and I tried to build a relationship networks between them. And during this entire building process, there's definitely a lot of issues I came across with. Like I would only say 30 to 40% of the people that are being determinedly identified by either Dr. Wellesley's annotations behind the photos or after the research was done. And the rest of the 60 to 70%, we're not entirely sure of their occupation or even their names inside of the farms. So I would say the project is definitely a long-term project because our final goal is to repatriate these photos into, their no matter whether caretakers or the patients, we're gonna send these photos to their descendants. So I would say there is really a long way for us to go after this. And unfortunately, because there's a lot of sensitivity issues, for example, privacy involved, so I couldn't really present the QMU document to you guys. But I think it would serve, during the entire research process, I definitely identify 2 or 3 people that sort of play an important role during the hospital during that time. There is one, I think she was the head doctor about at the time, and the second guy, he used to be, I think a firefighter in the hospital, and later he worked in the farm. So there's 2 people I found really important in the entire archive. But I mean, all the people that definitely play more or less a role in the history of the Cherry State Hospital back in the 1920s. And recently I've been working on the presentable, the website. So I can actually show you guys. So basically, this is the website I have, and in the home we have the background, and I chose all these pictures.
So as you can see, researching the individual caretakers quickly pointed to our larger questions. And what we didn't find and what we couldn't find made it clear that these pictures were more than a glimpse at hidden lives. They were an indictment of the systems which created them and failed the people within them. And our only choice was to take these people home. But we need not look to the past for images of state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. Our current moment is an urgent call to action and to caring with and for each other and taking the long road home to true social justice. I look forward to seeing you on that road. And I want to make a special shout out to Anita Bateman, our true north, without whom this project would not have made such an amazing leap forward. Thank you, everybody. Peace.